Well, thank y'all so much for being here. We appreciate you coming out. My name is Lindsay Lambert. I am the program director for PowerHouse Texas, and we are so glad that you could be here for our Energy Innovation Forum on how to build more transmission and reduce costs for Texans. A little bit about us. PowerHouse Texas was formed in 2022 by the Texas Energy and Climate Caucus. PowerHouse Texas is a nonpartisan nonprofit that educates and cultivates energy policy leaders through these energy innovation forums, as well as our Energy Policy Fellowship. This is for recent graduates with strong STEM backgrounds. Our fellowship takes place during the regular session. If your office is interested in hosting an Energy Policy Fellow next session, please let us know. We also do this through our Energy Policy Advisory Council, which pairs academic experts leading cutting-edge research on the electric grid, carbon capture, hydrogen, nuclear, geothermal, and more with the legislators who are taking the lead on these issues here at the Capitol. If you're interested in learning more about how your office could work with our Energy Policy Advisory Council, again, please come see me after the forum. We are also educating and cultivating energy policy leaders through our Energy Academy taking place this fall. This is for legislative staffers who want to stay informed on the evolving energy technology landscape and help shape the future of energy policy in Texas. This is for legislative staffers for the fall in August to October. It's going to be taught by our Energy Policy Advisory Council members. And if you're interested, again, come see me or one of our team members after today's forum. Last but not least, we're also planning energy tours across the state for legislators and staffers to see innovative energy technologies firsthand. Our first stop will be in Houston next month, May 9th and 10th, where we'll take a boat tour of the Houston Ship Channel to hear about their work on clean fuels and port electrification. Then an energy communities tour with Air Alliance Houston to hear directly from community members. Then we'll end at Net Power's testing facility in LaPorte, where we'll experience game-changing technology that uses natural gas and oxygen to fuel a supercritical carbon cycle that generates electricity while also capturing carbon. We do have a few spots remaining for legislators and staff, so if you're interested, please come see me or Patricia. Could you raise your hand, Patricia? Our executive director, thank you so much. Getting back to why we're here. The goal of our Energy Innovation Forums is to bring together academics, industry leaders, policymakers, and community leaders to explore the ins and outs of emerging energy technologies to help inform evidence-based policy solutions for Texas. I want to thank very quickly our PowerHouse Texas sponsors today for helping us make this event possible, the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance and CenterPoint Energy. I also want to thank our funders who make all of our work possible, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, the Meadows Foundation, the Jacob and Therese Hershey Foundation, Climate Works Foundation, Energy Foundation, and Katina Foundation. And last but not least, I want to thank our Texas Energy and Climate Caucus sponsors for supporting all the work that we do. We couldn't do this without your support. So I know I don't have to tell this group, we don't need recent headlines to know that transmission is desperately needed in Texas, right? But there have been a lot of headlines recently, which is, means that our conversation today is very timely. And with Texas experiencing such rapid population growth and increasing industrial activity, the demand for electricity is skyrocketing. However, our current transmission infrastructure is struggling to keep pace with this demand, which is why we've brought together the leading policy, academic, and industry experts on transmission today to lay out the barriers and talk about potential solutions to ensure that Texas remains equipped to meet the energy needs of its residents and businesses both now and in the future. So I just want to introduce our speakers before passing it off to Josh. First and foremost, we're so honored to have Representative Drew Darby here with us today. Can everybody help me give a round of applause? We also have Jason Ryan, Executive Vice President of Regulatory Services and Government Affairs from CenterPoint Energy. Thank you for being here, Jason. Our wonderful moderator, Matt Boms, Executive Director of the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. Thank you for being here, Matt. Dr. Joshua D. Rhodes, Research Scientist with the Weber Energy Group at UT Austin. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes is also on our Energy Policy Advisory Council. And last but certainly not least, Michael Lozano, Government Affairs and Communications for the Permian Basin Petroleum Association. Thank you for being here, Michael.
So Joshua Rhodes from the University of Texas at Austin, where I study energy systems and look at like how, how as a state we might supply the energy needs that we have. We are the biggest producer and consumer of energy of any given state, and things are changing. To go ahead and start off script, I will say if you can take that energy tour, that would be really fun, particularly the Houston Ship Channel. My uncle used to actually be a pilot in the ship channel and bring in oil tankers and cargo ships and cruise ships and all that kind of thing. And if you're out there at the right time, you might actually see people tanker surfing, which is really, really fun, which I've done with them a few times, which is crazy because you might get like a wave like for a few seconds on a beach, but multiple minutes in Bolivar Bay, which is really, really fun. Anyways, but we're here today to talk about transmission in Texas in particular. I was told to keep it high level, so let's start. What is transmission? And we always have to start with this obligatory picture of infrastructure, a beautiful picture of infrastructure, the big lines all perfectly symmetrical out in West Texas carrying power to where it is consumed in the rest of the state. But really, what is transmission? So a lot of people get transmission and maybe the grid kind of work them synonymously. I'd argue that the grid is actually two different parts. There's the transmission grid. These are the big wires and poles, like the pictures that I showed, the ones that move large amounts of power from where it's produced to areas where it might be consumed. And then there's also the distribution grid. That's the kind of the small wires and poles that you might see, running down your back alley or down city streets. These are, they've taken that, high amount of energy and they've stepped it down to lower levels of energy to get to the system. But it is all the grid there. It moves electricity from where it's produced to where it's consumed. But we're going to be mostly talking about the big wires and the poles, or the transmission system. So transmission lines in Texas, they span the entire state. So this is kind of this is what transmission would look like if you could see them from space. And yes, I did by hand draw this Texas on top of this map. This is the best drawing of Texas I've done freehand ever. I did get to follow the lines underneath. But we have a grid. Most of you know there's 3 grids in the U.S., East, West, and Texas. ERCOT serves 90% of Texas load, about 26 million Texans. And in that system, which is mostly represented by the lines in the state, there's about 53,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines that concentrated in areas where people are, where we're moving electricity around, but also from the west to the east as we're moving that power around. So transmission is important because our biggest sources of electricity, of energy, are not always close to load. And in the way that, our demand for electricity is changing, it's growing in certain parts of the state, it's growing faster, moving that electricity around to where we want to consume it is important. And so whether that's moving thermal electricity generated by thermal power plants, which, are generally, which traditionally have been closer to load, but have been moving further out to be for, air issues and other types of things like that, or things like renewables, West Texas, wind and solar, where our best resources are, moving those towards the center of the state where they are consumed. So we have built lots of transmission in the past. I know sometimes CREZ is a 4-letter word in the Capitol, but we have done it before, and it actually is a 4-letter word, CREZ. But it stands for the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones, and so this is, as in terms of legislative policy that built a lot of transmission, we've done that before in the past. And in fact, we found areas where we might want to tap into resources, and we allocated building that transmission to be able to move that energy from where it was being produced to where it wanted to be consumed. Just to refresh everyone's memory, back whenever we started this process back in 2005, one of the things, Texas has gotten about 50% of its electricity from natural gas for the about since then. Everyone saw the price of natural gas staying high. We didn't see the fracking boom coming. Things happened. We went out there to get that wind. Things changed, but we still filled up those lines. And there's a lot of words on this slide, but essentially it's just to say that we've done it in the past. We've built transmission lines in the past, and we've done it in relatively quick order. Passed SB 20 in 2005, and then by 2014 we had built lots of transmission that allowed for tens of gigawatts of power plants for wind and now solar to be able to move across to the to load in the center. And the CREZ law established a few different things, clarified how things would go, allocated who would be in charge of what, and then there was a clear process upon which it was developed, and so we did. We have built it. So we built transmission in the past through legislation. We've also been building transmission since CREZ. It's not just legislative action that builds transmission. This is kind of post-CREZ transmission line, billions of dollars of transmission that we've built in the state. There are essentially two ways that we build transmission. There's a reliability test, and hopefully we can get into a little bit more of that kind of in the questions. There's a reliability test, so these lines are needed to keep the power on. Soon we're going to run into issues if we don't build this. Then there's this economic test that projects can be shown, if they're built, to reduce system-wide total system cost. We've done less of that. Given how legislation has changed, that's probably going to be a bigger part of how things are built going forward. But there's essentially two ways we build it normally, if you can count the third one in kind of the legislation that we've done in the past. So we haven't stopped building transmission. We've been building transmission, but as we're going to see demand grow, I think we're going to need to build it quite a bit more. And so there's, in terms of transmission, it's not only just building new right-of-ways or building new lines. There are other things called grid-enhancing technologies. These are things that basically allow us to move more electricity over the same corridors and sometimes over the same lines, depending on how they're currently managed. Things like dynamic line ratings. Transmission lines have a certain rating. There's a certain amount of electricity that can move across them, but that changes depending on what the outdoor temperature is, what the wind is doing, how loaded they are. There's a lot of things that can change how much a transmission line can move at this minute versus, like, say, for an annual average. And we've been doing some of that, and also dynamic transformer ratings as well. So it's certain transformers can only accept so much power, but they can be changed depending on the conditions that they're in. Various power flow control and topology optimization, things that I'd love to talk more with CenterPoint about. And then, some other things, voltage capacitor banks, things we've been using on the distribution grid mostly for voltage support, and then things like advanced conductors. There's actually new wires, things that have carbon fiber cores that allow us to move more energy for the same size wire. And there are some utilities that are starting to look at deploying these advanced technologies. They cost more, but you can move more energy, and sometimes getting right-of-ways is the hard part. And so if we can reuse the existing right-of-ways we have, that can be useful. And we've done some studies looking at, what the benefit of building more transmission would be. And we found that, between now and 2040, that building transmission roughly between, 2/3 and about the amount that we built for the CREZ lines could reduce total system cost by almost $20 billion between now and 2040 if we're allowed to build more optimal generation in different places and move that energy from where it's being produced to where it's being consumed. And so transmission allows us to, move cheap energy around the state. It allows us to alleviate congestion, so we can make sure that, some folks aren't paying more for electricity than others. And it is essentially, literally, the backbone of the grid. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I want to use this panel and these great panelists to narrow down kind of how we can get this done as a state and what are the challenges and obstacles that we need to get through here. So my first question was for Representative Darby, and at the top, just thank you for your service to the great state of Texas. And I think we're all grateful for all the years that you put into your time here at the legislature. The question is a kind of two-parter. It's a long question. I'm going to try to make it as short as possible. The first one would be, what role does the legislature have in this expansion of transmission and making sure that it drives down energy costs for hardworking Texans? The second part of that question is, I think, on HB 2848, which a lot of folks on this panel and folks in the room had supported at the time. how can we get that kind of transmission build out passed, and what are the obstacles that you see to getting that kind of legislation passed next year?
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you. I feel like I'm a lone survivor, having gone through a process, and I'm glad to be here, quite frankly. It's a challenge. When I first started in the legislature in 2007, I remember gathering in Representative Swinford's office and pouring over a map, and he had all these transmission lines going through West Texas and North Texas, and I live and represent counties out in that area, and he's talking about the process, and he said, we're going to build all this. And I said, well, where is the power generation that's going to provide electricity for these lines? Because you're committing billions of dollars, and yet there's nobody's going to utilize it. And I can always remember, this is during kind of the movie, the baseball movie, in a cornfield in Iowa. If you build it, they will come. And that's what exactly David Swinford told me. He said, Drew, if you build it, they will come. Well, they have come. And those lines that you saw, the transmission lines, they're going crisscrossing through my part of the world. And why are they doing that? They're doing that to provide electricity for people who want to live in cities like Austin and San Antonio and Dallas and Houston. But they're coming across West Texas, and we're witnessing that burden. And of course, we don't want a lot more transmission, but we want what economic development those transmission projects bring, and certainly what it brings to the industry and the continued growth for the state of Texas. And so I've been focused on transmission. I'm a 50-year oil and gas lawyer, so it doesn't do any good to drill an oil well or a gas well and not get the product to market. Well, electricity is no different. When we have production in West Texas and North Texas, we've got to get it to market. I have been frustrated over the years with the congestion, because not only did we build it, we built more capability than we're able to utilize at the other end of that line on certain times of the day or weeks. That's a congestion cost, and what that means is regulatory authority is acting like a traffic cop and said, we can't have all this traffic on this road. Some of you are going to have to wait and delay your trip. Well, when they wait or delay their trip, that's inefficient. Their projects, their generation projects, are less efficient if they can only deliver 85% of what they're capable of delivering. And so that congestion cost in 22 was $2.8 billion. And I've watched that figure grow over the years, and it became particularly clear to me, having gone through the Winter Storm Uri, when we're sitting in 29 straight days of testimony over that disaster, and we saw production that went to waste off the Gulf Coast of South Texas could not get to the marketplace because we did not have adequate transmission. And so people went cold, people died because we could not get power generation from one part of the state to the other part of the state. And so my quest during my service has been to try to improve that. We worked in the 2021 session. I can't remember what number that is right now, but we worked with Senator Hancock and at that time Representative Phil King, 1281, and we made recommendations. We negotiated that bill heavily. I think there were some successes that allow small, short projects, 2 to 3 miles, primarily along the Gulf Coast, to go through without some of the regulatory oversight that we have in the process. So. Last session, we filed 2848 after 6 of the largest producers of oil and gas in this state had gone together and committed a survey and a study that showed the needs of the Permian Basin and what that was going to be reflected both now in the short term and in the long term. It was alarming. We negotiated with various TDUs, and we had a bill that I think had consensus, broad-based consensus with not only the oil and gas industry, but with the transmission folks. It did not pass. It passed out of committee, and as it wound up, 5066 passed. That I did not have a part of that. I thought that bill fell short of what 2848 was designed to do, but it was the consensus of the legislature that was not appropriate. One thing, if you want to find out who's opposed to something, find out who's making the money. If you're making the money with scarcity pricing, you're not going to want to change. And that's the dynamic that we have to deal with in the legislature every day, is the people who are making the money, they don't want to change the dynamics. They want to cry wolf, but yet they're the ones making the money from it. And in my opinion, to the detriment of the consumers. And we have large generation facilities that are being underutilized. They're not efficient. They're not located in where the load need is. Clearly, you can't put a wind farm in Westlake Hills out here west of Austin. You're going to want to put it in West Texas, where the land is cheap and the wind blows hard. And so West Texas providing not only the wind, the solar, now battery sites, but the oil and gas that's driving this state. And so I am frustrated by the lack of real progress that we had. I think 5056 may have accomplished some, and I'll let Michael talk more about that. But in my opinion, it fell short of where this state needs to be.
Okay, thank you, Representative. I think I'm going to hit on you, Michael, in one sec, and because I do want to touch on 5066, and the numbers are pretty astounding, really. Now the implementation has started. ERCOT has come out with an estimation of RTP load that's about 40 gigawatts greater than last year's forecast. So I think some of those numbers are going to push us eventually towards transmission, but I think we can all agree with Representative Darby that more action is needed from the legislature. So, Jason, I wanted to ask you a question, and thank you so much for being here. From the utility perspective, what do you see as the key regulatory challenges that we need to kind of expedite the planning and construction of all these transmission lines?
Well, we'll get into what else might need to be passed, but let me talk a little bit about how important it is to implement what has been passed, and with some urgency. So in 2021, we've already talked about Senate Bill 1281 that passed, and I believe my friend Doug Lewin tweeted at the time that it was the most transformative transmission legislation that had passed since the CREZ legislation in 2005. It hasn't been very transformative yet. Right? And potential. Yes, yes. And the importance about that bill, not only would it lower cost to consumers if you build transmission lines that pass that test, you get out in front of the problem that we have of ultimately needing more transmission to keep the lights on. So that's a tool in our toolbox that's not being fully utilized today. On 5066, I know we'll dive more into it, but I also think that needs to be implemented, again, with some urgency. We can't admire too long the studying part of that bill before we get around to building infrastructure on it. And I believe it was the exact right policy decision to start with the Permian Basin to address those issues. But hydrocarbons out of the Permian Basin can only be produced in the Permian Basin. So my concern about not implementing that more broadly is that if you want to locate in Texas or expand a facility in Texas, but there's not enough transmission to serve you, you don't have to locate here. So again, while I think the Permian Basin problem needed to be solved urgently, there are other urgent issues that need to be solved with 5066. So just a plug to make sure that we implement that legislation with some urgency. You know, I think that as it relates to Houston in particular, which is where my company is, there's not enough power in Houston to power Houston. What I mean by that is on the hottest and cold days and on most normal days, we import between 60 and 70% of the energy into Houston to serve customers from other parts of the state. That area is growing significantly, just like the rest of the state, but every year we add about 50,000 new homes and businesses to Houston. So think about a city that has about that much infrastructure, take a Waco every year and drop it into Houston, or if Chairman Hunter were here, I would say Corpus. It's Corpus every 2 years dropping into Houston. And they're largely not moving from other parts of the state. The largest petrochemical complex on the planet is in Houston. The largest medical center in the world, that if it was its own downtown would be the 9th largest downtown in the country, at Texas Medical Center. With hydrogen development, looking, if all the hydrogen that's proposed is built, it would add about 10 gigawatts of demand in the Houston area. It won't all get built. But to put that into context, the system peak right now is about 22 gigawatts in the summertime. So to think that you'll add 10 to that 22 is a fairly significant increase. And Houston also home to 26 Fortune 500 headquarters. So I mention all of that to create some urgency around building transmission to make sure that the Texas Miracle continues and is not something that people take a pass on because there's not enough transmission to power Houston. So that's my plug. That's why I'll stop on that. I do want to address affordability at some point, but I'll wait for another question on that.
Okay, that sounds good. And Michael, I'm going to get to your prompts. We're going to talk about
good.
Permian Basin. But for Dr. Rhodes, I was hoping you can touch on, you put that graph up a few minutes ago on the cost savings analysis that you've done, how much savings we're talking about for the state. Can you elaborate on some of those numbers and kind of the economic benefits that we're talking about here when we talk about this transmission build out?
Yeah, so that analysis looked at if we basically it was comparing two scenarios. If we, did not have if we had a scenario in the future where it was hard to build transmission, we made it hard to build transmission versus a scenario in the future where it was easier to build transmission. And we actually let the model decide how much to build and what was the most economic way to do that under each scenario. And it obviously it builds more transmission whenever it's more favorable to do that. But that allows us to develop more low cost resources that we've touched on kind of around the state, and allows more less congestion across the system. And so that's one way of doing it, and some of the other work we've done, which I think your question is a bit alluding to, is we've also looked at what the economic benefit of renewables have been across the state, and actually in every single county and district across the state. And we found that wind, solar, and storage, which are the technologies we were looking at, roughly around $20 billion in local taxes, and we'll pay roughly another $20 billion in landowner payments for leasing terms for over the lifetime of their existence. And that's just what we have now and what might get built in the next couple of years. But if you now look at the projections of, and that study was a couple years ago. If you now look at the projections today, it's even larger than that, and transmission allows more of that to happen. And the majority of those taxes and landowner payments are in more rural parts of the state, which typically get less economic development than some of the more urban areas. And so it's it's big money, and it can also be. One of the things when we were talking to county judges and other local officials, one of the things they really loved about having renewables is that it was a real consistent source of income. They could kind of plan on a 20, 30 year horizon because it was pretty known what their revenues were going to be versus some things like oil and gas can kind of fluctuate kind of on a global scale, and revenues can be more this year and less this year. It can make it harder to plan, but I don't think anyone sees us using less electricity in the future.
So I think, Michael, we're ready for.
You sure?
Yeah. If you can give us kind of an update on the progress being made on HB 5066, the reliability plan for the Permian Basin, and what do you see as the challenges if we zoom out for a minute and kind of think about integrating all of those energy resources coming out of the Permian Basin over the next several years, because the numbers are staggering.
They are. And also, I would also offer that often it's better for me to say less, so this might work out for my benefit anyway, to be last year. But at the end of the day, we don't get to this conversation with 5066 without leadership and effort. And to Chairman Darby's point, this conversation for transmission, I think the bill that you filed in 2021 was a month before the events that occurred during Winter Storm Uri. So this was a conversation we know we needed long time ago. And so to the point that we're talking about construction and transmission in the Permian, we're talking about plans in 5 years for things we needed in 2020. To be very frank. So we're not just playing catch up, we're playing catch up, look forward, build up, and maybe by 2038 we have what we need in 2024. So that's a real challenge for us. And I think we also recognize the unique nature by which oil and gas operates that is not quite traditional as Houston. While your growth is steady and built on rooftops, ours is not. But it doesn't make it any less substantive or large. And I don't think you get to 6.3 million barrels a day in the Permian with low growth and lack of investment. We know it's there. The other challenge for us has been that because this regulatory framework is so slow and challenging, and we don't also control the nature by which distribution facilities or transmission facilities build or permit their projects, our members have gone out and expended massive amounts of capital to build what they need. That's just what they do. If it's too slow from someone else, they will do it on their own. And significant numbers of our members own pretty extensive transmission and distribution facilities that match probably what should be localized in the area already. So, we're almost victims of our own success in that regard, that we're somewhat impatient. And I'll also offer, our members, and I think leadership in the building and also at the PUC and ERCOT recognize that at no point is our need for electricity going to reduce. We need it more. We need it much more. We need it more consistently. Our reliability is what will help people in the winter and in the summer throughout this country, throughout the state, within the ERCOT grid. And I think, we're really appreciative of the work being done on 5066 to really build this stuff out. And if we're talking about the staggering growth by which we're talking about, the April 1 report under the project number shows nearly 1,000 new circuit miles of transmission construction is needed, in addition to upgrading about 500 circuit miles and 18 distribution facilities, more transformers too. So this is a huge growth need. And I think while sometimes, especially I think to your point of urgency of implementation, sometimes the interim offers, and as having worked in the building before I did any of this stuff, I can tell you that sometimes it does feel like sending your dog to the Christie Nome daycare. That doesn't always work out. And so the dog gets taken care of. And so that's what happens in implementation. I think that's a challenge we don't want to see long term. And so we are focused and aggressively working to implement 5066. It's a priority for us because it's a priority for, I think, the state. And, not to boast a little bit more about the oil and gas industry in the state, but without this, we're talking about a significant economic decline in a state that drastically needs this industry, not just to promote the hydrocarbons and the growth in the Houston area. Because yes, while the Permian oil and gas industry produces Permian oil and gas, it doesn't get refined or processed in the Permian. It gets sent downstream so that those customers and people around the world can improve their quality of life too. So that's where I'll stay at that. I think I've said enough.
Yeah, no, that's great, Michael. And I think, I do want to come back to this, one of the comments that Representative Darby made on kind of industrial consumers, large industrial consumers that are making money off of grid congestion as we speak. And we've had, I think, specific events to point to over the last year that we all have kind of on our minds, being end of summer, winter storm, Heather earlier this year. I think those events are happening with a little more frequency. So I was hoping you can give us a little more information on that. How can we make sure that Texans aren't being burdened? Here we have a panel of TDUs, oil and gas, renewables. The whole industry is calling for this transmission build out. So what is it going to take to kind of get this over the hump?
Well, I mean, we might see it this summer. We have a lot of blackouts, rolling blackouts in the state. When consumers start feeling in their homes the lack of air conditioning, or hospitals' lack of air conditioning, I think you're going to see a motivated legislature when our constituents are inconvenienced and suffer because of lack of access to reliable energy. It's frustrating when some of the folks that you were just illuminating complain about transmission, but in a lot of instances, they avoid those transmission costs under 4CP. And so if they take that production off for 4 days a year, it's my understanding that they avoid those transmission costs. So I think there's a lot of, I don't want to dismiss certainly that concern, but I also have to look at consumers and access to low-cost electricity and generation is paramount. But we're going to have to start addressing transmission in the future. We cannot rely upon an interconnect agreement to decide whether or not we need to build a transmission line. We have to be, as David Swinford said, we have to build it, and we know they will come, and we've just been lacking in that regard.
I mean, I'll just offer too. I think, so much of this from the Permian side and the plan is much less that if you build it, they will come. It's we know they're already there. They're servicing their facilities, and frankly, not in the best manner in which is the most reliable on-site generation methods. And so, that creates challenges. For example, if a winter weather event were to occur at this point in time. Well, at this point in time, it'd be crazy. But this winter, if it were to occur, the last thing you would want is an operator having to go out and man or monitor, 130 generating facilities, to cover processing units and transport compressors. That offers us no value when we could have a gridded activity that does increase reliability and connectability.
That sounds great. So I think what I want to do, and we still have a few minutes, and I encourage people to start thinking about questions because I know we have a kind of Q&A coming up in a little bit. We still have at least 6 months until the next legislative session. We could think about the next session, but given kind of ERCOT's latest numbers and what was presented last week at the board, the fact that ERCOT leadership is taking this more seriously when we talk about transmission planning. Some new transmission planning ideas have been proposed at ERCOT. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, will it be enough? Are there kind of short-term solutions that you all think could work, at least until we get some legislative action here at the Capitol?
I'm darn glad we're not going to meet till January.
I was going to ask if that's too late or too short.
Yeah.
I mean, I can share some thoughts. Just to give you some context, it's a multi-year process to build transmission lines, a many year process. So if you started now, if I was given a project to go build right now from scratch, I could probably get it done before the end of this decade. So that, I think, highlights the need for moving now to meet the demands of a system that might exist in 2030, because we might already be too late. Now, so what we've been doing in the meantime is looking at ways that process can be shortened. So another bill that was passed last session shortened the review process at the PUC for approval from 1 year to 6 months. And so we appreciate that kind of looking at the process, look and see where it can be truncated. And we've actually had our first transmission line project that went through that more expedited 6-month review. And I think everybody saw that it can be done in 6 months without sacrificing the process, right? So if you're familiar with natural gas, you know that it will take up whatever space you give it. So if you put it in a room this big or put it in a room this big, it will take up that much space. That can sometimes be true of regulatory proceedings. They will take however much time you give them. And I think we've gotten comfortable that it doesn't need to take a year. You can do it in 6 months. And again, I think that's consistent with having some urgency around building this infrastructure, given that once I go through all the processes to ultimately get to my 6-month proceeding now, I still actually have to go negotiate with landowners and actually construct the thing. And that takes well in excess of a year as well. And that's if you don't have to go through federal permitting that could subject you to have to dealing with about 40 different federal agencies. So that's, I think, what we need to continue to look at is where in the process can we shorten things so that we get the infrastructure built before it's too late.
Yeah, and I think so. That the study that I showed up there that showed building transmission was good, reduced costs. We actually halfway through that study is when that S&P report came out showing this much growth in the Permian and Delaware basins. We had to go back and revise those estimates. And so yes, we well to take a step back, some of the criticism that I've heard, particularly from particularly some segments, some environmental groups about not wanting to build transmission out for oil and gas development, is that our model built transmission out for the oil and gas development, but then the model said, hey, look at all this transmission out here where all this solar is. Let's build a bunch of solar and wind out here, and they'll shift it back. So it's like, I think it's the same Field of Dreams moment, like if you build it, they will come. Like, and that's what our modeling was showing too. So yeah, no, I think it is something we need to do, and I'm hoping we can do it faster. I mean, CEO of ERCOT showed we can do it about twice as fast in Texas than they can in other regions. Probably still too slow.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question we had with our membership is, can we afford to not do this? When you talk about the existential existence of this industry and also the growth we know that exists currently and the continuation of that, I frankly think the answer to that is no. And, I think that doesn't, solve, doesn't make it happen overnight. Like you were saying, this is a process to get these lines in the ground in 5 years at best. And very, very optimistic about that happening quickly too with the Permian plan. And again, I think the credit ought to be due to where credit is deserved. And I think the PUC and the ERCOT, I think the Commission's taken this plan very seriously, and we're really appreciative of that. We've seen great reports. We'll see another one tomorrow for the May 1st report we're optimistic of. And so there's a really good opportunity here, I think, to also offer what I think has been begged as a question that's offered in the other portions of the bill. It's not just the Permian reliability plan. It's the high growth conversation there too, to go into rulemaking and really, look under the hood and figure out, to your point, Mr. Chairman, what can we do, what needs to be done in order to analyze these projects and these regions and areas where we know there's growth, and maybe offer plans that are similar, that are also reflective of the need and the dynamic growth that we're seeing across the state. Because I think that's how you solve a public policy challenge is through this hard work that is a pain in the ass, but it's required. And I think that's the goal.
Yeah. So I got one more question. I think we can open it up to the audience. And I think it's really for Dr. Rhodes, because there's one technology we haven't talked about yet, which is Grid Enhancing Technologies, GETS, which I think the acronym needs a little work. Advanced Reconductoring. Can you put it into basic layman's terms and help us understand some of this new technology and how maybe it might have a role to play in this whole conversation about transmission?
Yes, I mean, so with transmission, I mean, we're talking about moving electricity around, right? So it's basically, we have it here and we want it over here to use it, whether in our homes or in industry or commercial, whatever it is. And so but infrastructure, the wires, they can only push so much. They can only push so much power. The transformers can only push so much power. If you've ever blown a circuit breaker in your house because you're trying to run 7 different things on one circuit, it's a protection there to stop you from basically burning your house down. And that's similar in the grid. Is like we can only move so much energy over infrastructure. Otherwise, we might burn it down, which we don't want to do. But a lot of the ways that we've run systems in the past, and we've been in Texas. We've adopted some of these things already, but essentially, we would have like a stagnant number for a line. This line can only ever move this much power, but that's only under certain conditions. Actually, when it's colder outside, when the wind's blowing harder and the line's able to shed heat more, you can actually move more electricity over the same infrastructure. The same thing with substations and transformers. They can be dynamically rated such that they're able to sometimes move 20, 30, 35% more energy than their nameplate capacity is under certain conditions. But that's not always under all conditions. But that can allow us to move more infrastructure, or they can allow us to move more energy around. And then there's also different technologies that can be deployed or technologies swapped out that can allow us to move more energy over existing corridors. I mean, one of the hardest things about building transmission is that people can see it and it takes space. And now if you build transmission across someone's land, now there's certain things they can't do within the right of way of that transmission. And you scratch any Texan deep enough, you'll find a libertarian down there somewhere. And I think that can get to us, right? And so. But we have a lot of infrastructure deployed, as I showed in that map, and there are other things like these advanced conductoring technologies, which some utilities, I believe, like Austin Energy is actually trying some of these, a local municipal utility here, where you have different conductors that are the same size as existing conductors, but are able to move more electricity around for more advanced metals and different cores like carbon fiber instead of aluminum, and they're more expensive. But sometimes that can be even though a more expensive wire can be less expensive than an infinite cost of not building something. And then just different ways of managing the system, making sure we're routing power using optimal power flow devices to route power around congestion, where electricity might not naturally want to flow that away, but we can get it to flow that away with certain controls. So there's ways of essentially using our system more. I don't think it gets us all the way there. Then we still need to build more transmission, but particularly in places where it's harder to get infrastructure in, like into Houston. There's pretty crowded around Houston, and down on the coast and into Dallas and other regions that are pretty crowded to get that in. As we densify and build more, I think we do need to be looking at these technologies, because again, sometimes even though they cost more, that can cost less than not doing it.
Right. The question, if I could say it more succinctly, would be how do we reduce the interconnection time for new renewable projects in Texas, right? Or any new project.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of been the focus last 3 or 4 sessions. We're trying to do this, but we've run into roadblocks. The reality is, back certainly in 2005 and 2007, most of the generation was natural gas-fired plants, and that had a long runway for approving those projects, 8 to 10 years. And so you had a long time to develop a transmission system that would take advantage of that new generation source. But now, as you pointed out, geothermal and others, wind, solar, batteries for that matter, that time frame is considerably shorter, and we need to change our regulatory approach to approving these projects in order to expedite the transmission necessary for those projects to grow and be utilized fully. I'm frustrated under 1281. I think that required rulemaking, and we still don't have. That was in 21. We still don't have rules with regard to legislation we passed. I worry about 5066. I mean, are we gonna, Michael, get some rules out there, PUC, let's get this ball rolling. I'm frustrated by that. I'm frustrated by the continued congestion costs. I'm frustrated by we continually have our grid at jeopardy because we don't have energy where we need it. And so if this state's gonna grow, and we've got a lot of people out there promoting it, touting it, bringing people in, but guess what? Not only are they not bringing their electricity, they're not bringing their water. I'm from a part of the region where water is going to be the critical issue facing this state. Mm-hmm. And so when you combine all this, if we want to tout, we're the 8th or 9th or 10th largest economy in the world, then by gosh, we ought to conduct our business like we are and expedite that process and get these projects on the ground. If you got people willing to invest in power generation in this state, and our school children benefit from it, our landowners benefit from it, our economy benefits from it. Last time I checked, we eliminated the 313 agreement for renewables. I mean, we're sending some conflicting messages here. we have regulatory authorities that slow down the process and not look for ways to expedite the process.
Yeah, maybe one thing, and I know Cyrus has a question too, but maybe one thing to also look at, and Chairman Darby mentioned this earlier, that 1281 from the 2021 session had some exemptions in there for going through the full regulatory approval process to interconnect new generation of any kind, wind, solar, geothermal, coal, gas, whatever, if it's within either 2 or 3 miles. There are 2 different exemptions in there from existing infrastructure, as long as you have landowner approval for the route of the transmission line that's needed to interconnect them. I think that we should consider whether that's the right number of miles. You know, reasonable minds can differ on this, but if you have all landowner consent, I don't know that it matters how many miles it is if everyone's agreeable to doing it. And then I don't have to go through that now 6-month process. But importantly, I can't go through that 6-month process until I go through about another 6-month process of doing environmental studies, engineering lots of different routes to propose in that 6-month process. So you could cut a year off, most likely, if you think about expanding that exemption. And again, it requires all landowner approval to be able to use that exemption. And so that's another thought to think about.
Yeah, and I think probably having some more resources to do all of these studies required for either new generation or new load, because I mean the grid is a really big complex machine. I mean it's kind of amazing that you can trace your finger all the way, from the Panhandle down to South Texas, and you don't want to actually touch the transmission lines, but you could trace them down. And it's a big machine. But there's a lot of energy being put on, a lot of energy being taken off, and anytime we're making big changes on that, I mean, we do need to study what the implications of those things will be. And so whether it's a wind farm here or an AI training data center over here or whatever it is, it's going to have implications for the grid, for stability in certain regions, and so we probably need more resource as more and more load is trying to connect to the system and more generations trying to connect to the system. We probably need more resources to make sure we can study it faster, because we don't want to just throw a bunch of stuff on there and just hope for the best, because I'll tell you how that end, it won't end well.
I think we have time for one final question. I see Cyrus's hand is raised, and I also wanted to recognize and thank Senator Hall for being here. Thank you. Cyrus, just wanted to thank.
Hi, Cyrus.
Michael, I want you to build transmission lines because I want
Me physically.
Yeah, I want oil and gas to be electrified because it'll be cleaner, right, than running a bunch.
And more reliable and sure.
But here's my question: are all industrial loads equal? Because I was at that March RPG meeting where they said the load in 2030 is going to be 25,000 megawatts higher. Half of it's oil and gas, but half of it, let's say 25% of it is crypto mines. And I'm thinking, does it make sense
Yes.
for all of us to pay the subsidized cost of transmission to serve crypto mines that might only be around for a year?
Yes, because I would argue that we've underbuilt so much in that region of the state. There's no amount, even accounting for that, we could underbuild for that. So to answer your question, we have even more demand we know that we're not accounting for, including processing of produced water that would allow us to address some of this water concern we have in West Texas. So the answer is yes.
Lindsay, we have time for one more. We have time for one more final question for a brave volunteer. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we need a panelist from the PUC or ERCOT that will talk about being understaffed or lack of resources available. You're exactly right. The legislature on high produces these pieces of paper that require action from a lot of people. But yet sometimes we don't provide the resources for those people to be employed and work on our pet projects. I would be interested to hear from ERCOT, PUC, about staffing issues. I'm absolutely positive the Appropriations Committee in the Texas House and Senate Finance are going to be considering proposals that will address any shortcomings with regard to employees or resources that are needed to fulfill the vision that the state has. So, I just look forward to that discussion if that is a loss, if that's where we're falling short because we don't have enough people to do the studies, then I for one would be interested in seeing how we can address that.